Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We have a special guest today. It is an honor and a pleasure to have here today a good friend of mine, Professor David Robles. Professor David Robles is an assistant professor in the Institute of Public Safety at Salt Lake Community College. He is also he's received his master's degree in community leadership from Westminster College, and he has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice with an emphasis in law enforcement from Weber State University. His expertise include criminology, juvenile justice, social justice, public policy, emergency management, prison, industrial complex, right, and all of that, criminal justice system and its history, victimology, among other things. Professor Robles is on the Unified Police Department's mobile crisis response team, where he provides victim advocacy. Professor Robles is also part of the National Center for Victims of Crimes, and that's a nonprofit organization that advocates for victims' rights, trains professionals who work with victims, and serves as a trusted source of information for victim issues. Professor Robles is also a squad leader with the Salt Lake Community Sheriff's Mountain Search and Rescue Team. He's also served as an editor, a chief editor for the Transformative Justice Journal. He has over 10 years of experience working with nonprofit organizations, where much of his focus has been centered around social justice and human services. Interesting also is I did a little bit of research and I found that Professor Robles, I don't know if you knew this, but you also have 5-star ratings pretty much from all your students on ratemyprofessor.com. They talk about how you're an inspiration to them. You give them great feedback. You're very caring, and they really respect you.
Now I'm flattered. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Professor Robles is a Mexican-American mountain biker. He enjoys exploring the Wasatch Mountains on foot and on bike with his family. He's married and has 2 children and 1 on the way. Professor Robles, thank you for being here with us today. This is an honor and a pleasure. I appreciate you. So thank you.
No, thank you. That's quite the introduction, Ramon. I think I haven't felt this special since I think my 9-year-old birthday. So thank you for that. All that's needed is the candles. So thank you.
Next one. At the next show, I'll have the candles, and we'll have to do that one in person though. That's the work.
Yes, perfect.
So, David, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and start with, I'd love to have people just kind of know who you are, where you grew up. Maybe we can start there. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you can imagine, I like talking, considering that it's a central part of my profession, as an educator. And so I'm happy to take this part. With my upbringing in mind, I was born and raised here in Salt Lake City, Utah, specifically West Valley City. I always poke a little bit at the dominant culture here in Utah and identify that I was born, raised, and forcibly assimilated. I think there's little bits of us that stay with us as we maneuver and navigate these spaces within our life that we end up touching. And so part of me is a Utahn. I also had a major part of my upbringing take place in northern Mexico. So where my family's from is Zacatecas. Very country, very farm-oriented lifestyles, rural areas, very much so focused on and elevated with the Catholic belief system and lifestyle. And so this was a big part of my lifestyle as well growing up. I grew up in a big family, one that has a lot of presence here in Utah, but also in Mexico. And my more immediate family, I'm one of 5 brothers. And so I'm right dead center in the middle. My mom always made the note that we're like the fingers on her hand. We're all a little different, but all connected. I always questioned if I was the thumb or not. So a little stockier of a kid back then, but so I'm dead center in the middle. I'm the middle child out of the 5. And my parents are still living here in Utah. We have a very close-knit family. We see each other fairly often. And, growing up here was fairly interesting in terms of the way I perceived myself, but also the way I perceived my goals. For a long time, I saw myself as this agent of change that wanted to make my way into the criminal legal system and bring forward different forms of change and reform, and even as radical as ideas of abolishment that crossed my mind. Once I got into college, things started to shift a different direction. I started to reevaluate ways in which I could potentially change the system from a policy-oriented path, which motivated me to enroll in a community leadership-based master's program that focused heavily on social change and social justice. I will be honest and say I never thought I'd see myself as an educator. It was never part of the plan. I think a lot of us as career seekers or even professionals currently in a career, we often think of ourselves as children and say, what did you want to be when you grew up? And this never crossed my mind ever. And it's interesting how the different layers and the nuanced experiences that took place and how they led me here in a almost predestined way is the way it feels like sometimes. And so, I'm an educator now. I love teaching. I love what I do. I love being at the community college. It's hopefully clear that my students like me, considering what you mentioned in my introduction and the reviews that I receive. My plan moving forward is I keep making these goals, right? I have these small goals after every class session that I engage in, where I sit down with myself for 5 to 10 minutes and reflect upon, things that went well, areas of improvement. And those are these, little micro goals is what I call them. And then, thinking in the bigger picture, through this wider lens, I often am looking at myself in ways I can keep learning. And so much so that this is the first time publicly I'm announcing that I'll be starting a PhD program in the fall.
Nice.
And so,
Good job.
yeah, and so I'm excited. I'm excited for that, and we'll see where it takes me. My wife and I were also expecting a kid in the summer, and I don't know, people around me often say, you've accomplished a lot of things, and I always answer and say, I don't know, maybe I like to suffer, because it feels very heavy and enduring at the time that I'm experiencing it. But looking back, it seems so much easier. I don't know if that's me lying to myself based off of my reality, but yeah, I put in a lot of work, and I think part of it is the selfish part of me that wants to feel fulfilled, wants to have a sense of value in this life, in this world, this thing that we have been introduced to, and so I want to fulfill that for myself. But then the other part that keeps me motivated is, I've seen a lot of people suffer in my days, and I think that's the other motivating factor, is how can I change things or ensure things or teach things that even shift the needle a little bit away from violence or abuse or whatever we want to categorize as something that could negatively impact someone. And so, yeah.
And it's a very complicated field, and it's a very it's a difficult goal, right? To try to be a force for change, right? It's a complicated structure, right? That you're whether you're talking about the prosecution's office or you're talking about the criminal justice system as a machine, right? But
Yeah.
before we get into that, I'm curious about something. I mean, ever since I've known you, you seem very driven. Like I've noticed that about you, and I think our listeners can see that, right? You're very driven. I'd love to know where that comes from. Like, there's got to be something
Wow. Yeah. That's a
that.
that's a that's a beautiful question. And it makes me think automatically as you're asking it of my parents. That's the first thing that comes to mind is, I'm a first generation Mexican American in the United States. And, my parents didn't have the opportunity at their disposal to engage in academics or fulfill a degree or even a high school diploma, if that. Their whole life was very centered on working and providing. And the selflessness that I saw within the way in which my parents made their way to this country and elevated us to a comfortable position. I will say, like, there were some hard days. We were on food stamps. We were um, you know, very reliant on social systems such as the education system that provides meals for us. And we're very grateful for those systems, because if they weren't there, we could have, starved for a day or two. But considering that those systems were there, it allowed for my parents to get into a comfortable position economically, and that allowed them to provide us a life that made us be able to look at our own lives in parallel to their lives and say, wow, we can do it too. Like there was in from a more philosophical perspective, there's borders that we can cross as well, that our generation, our lineage, our family history had never even considered or even felt accepted in or had access to. And so I think for a long time I felt pressure, in the essence of carrying a lot of the weight that I felt like was being expected upon me. And then I think there was a shift, and I think that shift took place during my fourth year in my undergrad program, where I started to meet a lot more students from diverse backgrounds. I started interacting with um, the multicultural office up at Weber State University. So I started being exposed to these other experiences, and then I didn't feel so alone. Right. Like I think a lot of people misunderstand what I'm getting at right now. And to clarify, um, Utah is a very homogenous state in terms of the dominant class and race that lives here. And so it was difficult for me to be able to visualize and see success and see myself there when I never had that model. And whether it's biological or sociological, it hit differently, as the kids would say these days, right? It hit differently when I saw someone else who looked like me, who had very similar experiences to me, who I could relate to, and they had gotten to a position that I was trying to seek. And it made me feel inspired. And so for a very long time, I felt this generational expectation and this weight that I was carrying up this hill every day. Like, I'm going to be the martyr. I'm going to be the one that takes my family out of poverty and provide my family with, a home and purchase, their dream cars for them and all these things. And it shifted at that point where I started to say, wow, this is for me too. Like, this is for myself as well. And yes, they can benefit from what I'm about to accomplish in this life, but so will I, right? And it didn't feel like a chore anymore. And I don't know if that resonates with people as often as I like it to, but I think oftentimes there's those pressures, right? Those expectations, and they're often very subtle. They're very insidious. We almost place it on ourselves in society's expectations and the roles that it provides for you and expects of you. And yeah, I had a more positive outlook on what my goals were, and I started to accomplish them at a faster rate. And so instead of feeling like I was carrying all this weight, I felt elevated by the people around me. And it made it easier to accomplish these things. It made it easier for me to um, reach those goals and not feel as exhausted at the end. I felt like I had more stamina.
Right. You touched on a little bit about your relationship with your parents. I'd love to see if you could just expound on that just a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a beautiful relationship with my parents. It wasn't always that way. I got into quite a bit of trouble as a kid. Was fairly defiant. And keep in mind, we come from a household that was often unsupervised. We had a lot of downtime for ourselves, and you get, um five boys in a household, and you have a neighborhood that also has a bunch of unsupervised children. And we were just out on the streets. We were street kids. We were out riding bikes. We were out getting into trouble. We were doing all sorts of things, both legal and illegal. And you know, it was an upbringing that I look back on, and I appreciate it in many ways. I think it allowed me to relate and be exposed to experiences that I don't think a lot of people have the opportunity of doing so. But my relationship with them early on wasn't so great. You know, they often viewed their parenting through this form of reinforcement with the with, you know, the symbolism that's attached to Mexican households, right? Forms of corporal punishment, you know, the chancla, the bell, you know, things like that, right? Those were kind of the reinforcement tools that were used. And I'm excited to talk about more of this in relation to our criminal legal system in a little bit. But uh, with that in mind, you know, as I got older, I started to appreciate them more. I think that happens a lot for people as you start to appreciate your parents and realize like all of the you know, all of the suffering that they were going through to benefit you. And it made me put a lot of things into perspective, and it has allowed for this really positive relationship to blossom. My mom texts all of us every morning and tells us good morning. She gives us her uh her bendición and praise, and you know, she's a great grandmother. My dad was a little bit more absent, not intentionally, but because he was working multiple jobs often. But our relationship has always been really positive. He's a little bit more of an introvert, but a very charismatic individual, very simple, simple in terms of the way he views his world and the life that he lives, and um, uh, a man of many trades. I swear he surprises us every day with what he can do, and we realize all of the things that he had to learn along the way. And um, yeah, I love them both dearly, and you know, they're a pivotal point of my inspiration in the ways in which I operate.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah, I can resonate. You know, I mean, it resonates with me. I can relate to a lot of what you're saying. Yeah, it's you go through stages, right, with your parents, right, where you're younger, you may not appreciate them as much, and then
Yeah.
older, and then you realize, wow, they really. And I can also, right away, I can also relate to what you were talking about with the pressure that to try to be successful, to be able to provide them with, you know, their dream cars, or provide them with a more comfortable lifestyle, to be able to take care of them, because you get to a point you understand how much they've worked and sacrificed to be able to provide you with the opportunities that you now have, so that you know, bringing it back to your situation so that you can live the life you're living, and now even chasing, you know, PhD, right? So yeah.
Yeah, it's you know, it's interesting how these decisions uh change the trajectory, right? Like my mom brought it up a lot, mostly in terms of discipline when we were younger, and forms of threats, right? But in saying, you know, if I would have never left the rancho, right? Like if I would have never left, you guys would have been, you know, living this way, living a different way. And we always would joke about it, but it's very real in the in the essence of, you know, where we ended up and how we are able to access certain things that we wouldn't have been able to access. um and so there's definitely some great benefits, and there's a lot of pride with that decision that was made, and the lifestyles that we get to live.
Right.
But as you know, with anything, there's also criticisms, and there's paradoxes, and
Yeah.
dichotomies, and we all live in a contradictory way in different ways. But
Yeah. In fact, that's a great transition for something you touched on a minute ago that I'd love to be able to dive into now, which is, you talked about corporal punishment and how maybe the connection with between that and criminal justice system, and just, you know, that whole area there.
yeah,
Maybe you
yeah.
can speak on that just a bit.
You know, interesting. Ironically enough, my intro to criminal justice class today had this very discussion on
Yeah.
corporal punishment. So it fits well with the theme for today.
Yeah.
So jumping into theory for a second.
Sure.
uh, One of the ways many criminologists identify the, let's call it the brain of our system, is through what's called a social control theoretical model. And so, to not overcomplicate this, it's essentially saying that the brain of our system believes that everyone in a society is pleasure seeking, or what they categorize as hedonistic. So therefore, if you have a person in their natural sense, their most primitive sense, they are susceptible for potentially committing crime because there's pleasure with some of these illegal activities, right? And we're talking about some of the violent ones, but also we're talking about a lot of non-violent crimes. And so when you have this brain of the system, you also need a body, right, to be able to reinforce and accomplish what this brain's trying to do. And so if you look at the anatomy of the system, it operates through what we identify as deterrence models, right? So these deterrence models are all around us. We call them these mechanisms of deterrence. So they could be increasing guardianship, like, hey, I'm going to buy a firearm so I can protect my home, or I'm going to buy a surveillance system so that I can increase my guardianship at my home, or one of those doorbell alarm cameras that everyone has these days, right? So those are all forms of increasing guardianship, and we can go on and on about those pieces. But the basic breakdown here is society places itself in the responsibility of, and when I'm talking about society, I'm talking about a government or institutional entity that has power. And the government places itself in a responsibility where they say, okay, if the world is hedonistic, then we have to create a world where we deter people from committing crime, or we appeal to them and create these social bonds ideas, right? And these social bonds ideas are things like, let's promote the nuclear family, for example. Like, let's promote this nuclear family because we see positives attached to the nuclear family, where someone who aligns with that is less likely to commit a criminal act or deviance or violence. And then there's commitment. Let's put value on a capitalistic system so that people don't engage in crime and are focused on a craft or a career or a job or even gaining an education, right? That's the commitment piece. And then there's the attachment, and then there's the involvement. And involvement essentially says, okay, it's not enough for the family attachment. Let's have them value the community that they live in. So let's get them involved. Let's get them to do service. Let's promote those ideas. And then there's the belief system. And the belief system is a very powerful branch of this social bond idea. And the belief system essentially says, we need to make sure that we guide them through these moral principles that also parallel the legal system, right? So that they don't just see themselves as, hey, I need to follow this law, this human-made thing, but also, hey, there's these moral principles that as a spiritual or religious person, I follow those things as well, right? So they're able to translate those two things together. Now, to take it back to corporal punishment, the ways in which we punish, we call these reactions to crimes, right? Or reactions to deviance, or reactions to people breaking social norms. The ways in which we react to them can happen at an informal level or a formal level. So formal would be like laws, police, and our correctional system, right? Our correctional system is not the most appealing place. It doesn't promote itself as Disneyland, right? It's not like, hey, come on in, right? The architecture is very intentional. Whereas on the informal side of social control, you have things like parents or workplace or educational institutions. And these themselves are also reinforcing a very similar structure because we're all byproducts of it, right? And it's so funny. My students often aren't convinced enough that we are byproducts. And we take a quick poll and ask, how many of you locked your car before you came in? And people are like, yeah. How many of you have a code on your phone? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, statistically speaking, a very small percentage of you have actually been victimized. And not to minimize that reality, that's definitely real. But we have become socially conditioned through these theoretical frameworks that now we are the control theorists, right? Now we're like, I can't trust anyone. And so now we operate under that lens. And the same thing goes for the way we punish. So when we talk about corporal punishment, it's an extension, an informal extension off the arm of deterrence. And it's basically identifying as itself as a form of law, right? But within the household, right? We call them rules. And so the rules of the house are, hey, don't be out too late. don't swear, don't talk back, and then here are your consequences if you get that, right? And so corporal punishment is an interesting phenomenon, and also an interesting thing to observe, because we never in any of these situations, whether it's formal or informal, are we asking what is the root cause of why you're doing this.
Mhm.
So we never ask that question, right? We never like, what is the root cause of why you were out late, right? We just reinforce a punishment because you better know, you are expected to know better.
Right,
And then we punish and then we move on, right?
right.
And you could say the same about our formal criminal justice system. And um so that's the rabbit hole of theory if we want if we
Yeah.
want to go down that route. But um
What's
hopefully that made some sense.
it made a lot of sense. I'm curious to know what your opinion is. Do you think, because I think at this point, I have not looked into the laws recently, but I believe corporal punishment is illegal. I mean, it wasn't, but I think at this point you could potentially, a parent could face criminal charges for that. But I'd love to know what your position is. Do you think that's a good way to approach it? Approach, child rearing, or
Great question. So corporal punishment is currently still legal in the United States.
okay,
Um, but it's not enforced through like a government-based entity. It's allowed through parental forms of discipline, right? Now, corporal punishment used to be allowed within the legal system, specifically within prisons and jails, and that is no longer allowed. But in regards to parent rearing and parental forms of discipline, corporal punishment is still allowed. And the way Utah defines it in its simplistic sense of the law is as long as it doesn't leave a mark that lasts more than 24 hours, like a parent is good. And so, some of the criticisms attached to that can be brought up in regards to emotional or psychological forms of abuse, which a lot of the science is identifying that these can be even more detrimental or bring forth even more impactful alignments with forms of criminality or deviance or increased violent tendencies. And so I think for me it's a weird dichotomy that I live in. I see and I guess just to back up and personalize it a little bit. So my parents did instill corporal punishment on us. They spanked us. They used various types of mechanisms to spank us, like a spoon or the belt or a shoe. Um, but I did see my mom, who was the reinforcer for the most part, I did see her go through a transition. And I think that gave me a whole new perspective on the way I saw my own parenting and the way I exercise my current parenting, which I don't spank my children whatsoever. But it did allow me to see, hey, things can be different. We can engage in a different way when it comes to discipline. And it's interesting because I look at my two younger brothers who, they had some spankings here and there, but it wasn't as common for their upbringing as it was for myself and my two older brothers. And there's a different relationship, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I at least have a feeling that there is in terms of the connection with my mother. And I think that could be something to look deeper into, is identifying these sort of these bonds that are existing and the way they can be strained based off of ways in which parents might think they're applying the best form of discipline. And so where I stand currently is in the way I exercise my current parenting style, and that's a no hit policy, right? I don't even default to it. It's not something that crosses my mind. And I think we're seeing a massive wave, not only in the informal sense of looking at punishment, but we're also seeing it at the formal sense of looking at punishment, right? There's a specific alignment here on why we're seeing a wave of reform in the prison and against the carceral state. These are definitely in line with each other, and so they go in parallel to each other in many ways, and I think they'll continue to do so.
What types of changes are you seeing in the carceral system from your perspective?
Yeah, I think here's the complex answer. I'll give you the simple answer first, and then the complex answer. No, not many. That's the simple answer. The complex answer is we know what works, or at least we have research that reinforces what could work.
Sure.
And we also have ways in which we can instill new ways of looking at what can work in terms of rehabilitation, or what we're talking about in general is just corrective action, right? Like, how can we correct someone's behavior? And interesting enough, our correctional system here in the United States grounds itself off the principle and values of rehabilitation. But I think if you were to ask someone, let's say we grabbed a Martian from outer space and brought them and said, here's the definition of rehab, and we gave them a tour of the prison, I think they'd say, this is not rehab. And I think they'd agree, right? And so, like, that's how apparent the problem is. And so when we look at this from a more complex perspective, when the system was being introduced during what we call the classical era, there was these new ways of looking at penance and looking at how people should be punished and what's better for society. And a lot of them are based off of these religious principles, right? Infusing forms of penance through this like Quaker lens that was instilled in penitentiaries. This is where we get the name penitentiary, right? Through the word penance. And so you have these forms of penance that are taking place. And then they started to elevate and co-opt the name of justice, right? We started to be like, okay, justice is retribution, justice is punitive, right? The person has to pay. And then the question always bears to mind, well, what the heck are we going to do? Because the majority of those people that we put away in cages are going to be out eventually. And I'm not minimizing or diminishing what people might do to be there in the first place. There's some violent acts that could take place. But for us to wipe our hands clean and walk away and say, okay, you served your time, good luck, let's hope you don't do it again, that's not the best approach, right? And we can look at this from a more relatable perspective, from the informal sense of parenting, and say, okay, if a parent goes and puts a child in a timeout, let's say, and puts them in a room, what's the likelihood of them doing it again, right? And there's other factors there, psychological, sociological, all those other things. And so what I'm getting at here is, during the 1940s, there was a Chicago school of thought that introduced these neighborhood studies. So if anyone's viewing this afterward, look into the neighborhood studies. And the neighborhood studies essentially said, we are holding the wrong type of approach when it comes to accountability. We're holding the individual accountable, but we have to understand that there's layers here that make up an individual. The individual just didn't appear one day and say, hey, I'm going to commit a crime. That there's societal factors here at play that can induce criminality more than others. And these neighborhood studies essentially said, why is there such a prevalence of crime in this particular section of a neighborhood, or this zone, as they called it? And they identified, well, there's these social factors, there's disparities, there's low wages, there's lack of access to resources, there's low educational graduation rates, there was all these things, right? And so they said, whoa, we can try to improve this and decrease the prevalence of crime by improving these systems. But here's where we went extremely wrong, and we continue to do so. So this classical school that was very focused on penance and swift, severe, and certain punishments, that still exists today. So the current era we're under, we call it neoclassical. So we essentially had the pig in classical, and then now we just put lipstick on it, right? And if you're getting at the graphic I'm getting at. Yeah. So we put lipstick on it, and we were like, all right, society, here's your system. And all the researchers and the positivists from this particular era are like, no, the problem is the pig, right? Or the problem is the prison. Here's an example. We started to see a large amount of prison education programs started within prisons, right? And one of the reasons why we started to see this is because a lot of research started to come out in identifying the benefits of gaining an education, right? They correlated, if someone has an education and the higher their education is, the less likely they're commit criminal acts or violence or deviance, right? And so we started to promote education. This is where this whole wave of access to education comes from, and affirmative action and all these things, right? And so with that in mind, we started this prison ed program in the prison setting. But many research are saying, no, you just put lipstick on the prison. The problem is the prison. And that's where the arguments are taking place right now. And so the changes that you asked about, what are we seeing and what are we not seeing? What we are seeing is we're seeing more lipstick, we're seeing more mascara, we're seeing powders, we're seeing all those things applied, right?
Yeah.
But what we're not doing is grabbing the actual system and changing it.
Right. Right. You know, it's interesting because you invited me to come talk to some of your classes, and I've touched on this a little bit, but it's and then just a little bit, right? But it's really the way that the system is set up right now, and it's a complicated issue. I get it; it's a complicated issue, but you put somebody who's, you know, did something that they were not supposed to, right? They broke some sort of law, but you put them in a prison system. And I don't know what the time period is, right? Whether it's 6 months or a year, and it depends on the person, I'm sure. But at some point, you start really, like, the person starts to change. And then you take somebody who maybe had one small problem, right? Maybe whatever it was, right? They smoked weed or decided to sell drugs. But now you took that person that had a minor little problem that could have been rectified some other kind of way, right? Something more constructive. But now they come out to society, right? Whether it's a year or 10 years later, and they have a whole slew of other issues because it's like this pressure cooker, right? And it's not good for the individual. It's not good for society, and it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, because like I said, it's complicated. I realize you have to kind of. There's some people that definitely cannot operate in society. I get that. There's some people that just have some they need some serious work before they can be, you know, out around other people because they're just way too violent, or they got tendencies that are just, you know, that are harmful to other people. And but that's the extreme, right? Like, what percentage of people?
Yeah.
You know my past. I was incarcerated for 12 years, and I think that there's definitely a percentage of people like that, but I don't think it's nowhere near the percentage of people think. I think for most people, you put them in there. And what you get out of it is actually you get somebody that comes out into society that's worse off. They're less likely to be a better person, right? To really function well in society. They got a whole slew of other problems now that they have to deal with. But anyways, I'd love to get your thoughts on that because
no, thank you for that. And as always, thanks for always coming to my classes. My students appreciate it. With I what you're presenting here is very well aligned with the prison industrial complex, right? We've become reliant on something that we have come to realize isn't working and may have never worked the way we intended it to, right? And that's hard to step away from. There's these ideas of the ways in which we view stress, strain, or pressure in society, and the way we adapt to that strain, stress, or pressure. There's a theorist in particular who created these forms of adaptation, right? And he goes by the name of Merton. And so these forms of adaptation, essentially, we're looking at the way in which strain takes place subjectively for an individual. And it's very easy in a society to be a conformist. This is what the dominant of what our society is. These are people that align with the means of society and align with the goals of society. Very unlikely to commit criminal acts, right? They're conformists. And in many ways, we become conformists when we have a lot to lose, right? We start to become reliant on the system, whether it be financially, whether it be because of the preservation of one's own perspective of life. So those are all things that could happen. What we don't often address in this sort of strained idea is there's also what's known as these retreatists. And this is who makes up a big proportion of the people that are incarcerated. These are people that Merton identified as not aligning to the means of society nor the goals of society. So they're likely to commit criminal acts. And these are people who are often addicted to drugs. These are often people that are alcoholics. These are often people that are suffering from mental illness. These are often people that we see on the street and we walk by and are unsheltered. And so when we look at those problems, we need to understand that they didn't just appear, right? That there's layers attached to them. You know, I was talking to a student yesterday, and there's a population in particular that we often negate to think about when we're talking about people that are unsheltered or incarcerated, and that's veterans, right? We have a large amount of veterans that are unsheltered or incarcerated, suffering from these things that, you know, that were induced upon them, right? That they weren't born with in many ways. And they culminated to these negative experiences, negative perceptions, and they created this strain, right? So much so that they don't see themselves within society anymore. There's a disassociation. And so when you disassociate and you have nobody in your corner to back you, what are you to do, right? We've almost created the monster ourselves, right? And this started way back during the Industrial Revolution, right? Like we're talking about mass industrialization, mass urbanization, mass migration, right? We started promoting this American dream, and we marketed ourselves and branded ourselves to the world. And first we started with poor European migrants, right, and their families, and then we exploited them, and then we moved on to and prior to that, don't get me wrong, there's the exploitation of Chinese laborers, right? And then we moved on to Latin America, right? And we started to go through that. And before all of this, there was the exploitation of Black men, right? And Black women and children. And so when we're identifying these things, we've become reliant, and therefore we create these monsters, right? And we ask ourselves, where did this all stem from? And one of the roots that we often uncover in asking this question is this economic stability, right? It's this economic stability, right? What are we to do without prisons if we started to benefit financially from them? What are we to do without the manufacturing of certain things if we started to actually have contracts within prisons? We have companies like Victoria's Secret and Starbucks that contract. We even have contracts with the government through their own entity of the correctional facility that are manufacturing things like license plates, right? And so we have the exploitation that exists there, and we rebranded it. We put lipstick on it, right? And we said, hey, here's a new version of it. And yeah, I could go deeper into this conversation, but it's follow the paper trail, right? And you start to realize that there's a financial motivator. And I don't want to separate myself from this observation, because I too am a conformist, right? I have children, I have a partner, I have things in my life that have put me in that position to do so. So I can be all hypercritical and theoretical all I want, but also the ways in which I operate in my daily life are very much so from a conformist lens. And I understand that.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned, and this was not part of one of my questions, what I mean, that I wanted to ask you, but you're touching on it now, and I think it's interesting. And I don't know, I'd love to get your thoughts on it. This is something that there's a number of very smart people, right? Experts, psychiatrists, people that do, research, and they're talking about this growing trend, and it's a threat, right, to the entire country, to the entire, the stability of the nation. And it's this trend of people moving away from being conformists, right? So women are not getting married, men are not getting married,
Yeah.
they're not going to college, right? Like men are deciding just to choose to not go, right? And you were talking about education earlier, about how the higher the education, the less likelihood that there is that they'll turn to violence or committing crimes. And it's interesting because I've met some pretty smart guys that have decided not to go, right, to go to college, but I definitely can see there's a difference, right? There's a little bit of an edge to them, if I can put it that way, and not necessarily a bad thing, but they're not conformist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because it's one of the guys, and I wish I knew his name specifically because he says, look, we're over here fighting terrorists and trying to start wars here and there. And he says the biggest threat to the stability of this entire nation, and he says, and it's to the tune of millions and millions every year. We're producing millions and millions of of men that are not married, that are not going to college, that are, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so it's young men, right? And that's what they focus on because of, that's where they do their studies. But this also applies to single men in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and right. But anyways, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because it connects with this whole idea of education. Not, you said I'm a conformist, and then these guys are not being conformists, and that's a growing trend. And it's only like if you look at the charts and the graphs, it's only going to get worse, right? And worse, I say, but it's just going to continue going in that direction, whether for better or for worse.
Yeah. So, it's and I should have emphasized this when I was talking about the forms of adaptation, and keep in mind that they're not deterministic, right? Just because I'm a conformist today and let's say tomorrow a civil war breaks out, I may no longer be a conformist. You can change, right? And so one of the other branches that you're actually getting at here is what's known as ritualists. That's the other subcategory that's less likely to commit crime. So ritualists, they like the means of society, meaning they like to obtain certain things in that realm, but they don't necessarily align with the goals of society. So they might just be the actors out here engaging in their daily lives, going through the mundane, and not trying to pursue these societal expectations or these cultural expectations. You're touching a lot on these cultural wars that are taking place behind closed doors, right? We're seeing them in different social media platforms. We're seeing conversations. They're kind of always hidden in the shadows. And the needle's moving a little bit. It's definitely moving. We're starting to see perhaps a new version of what conforming is. And that might be the shift in which it happens, right? Because being a conformist isn't stagnant. It could change based off society's expectations or what they demand of you. One of the other ones that could be heavily involved here, as you're talking about these individuals that maybe have the goals that other people have, and these could be like goals of obtaining a house and being economically stable. These are what we call innovators, and they are likely to commit crime. So they don't like the means of society, but they do like the goals. And so these people are like the get rich or die trying people, right? Like they're like, we're gonna get there somehow. And we see a lot of white collar criminals in this arena, and then we also see a lot of street crimes that are taking place within innovation. And these could be people that are selling drugs, that got their own hustle. And they're trying to still obtain society's goals, maybe that house, maybe that economic stability, a family, but they don't connect with the means of getting there. They're like, I want to play the system and do it my way. I want to get it quick, right? And so, there are definitely tiers to all of those. And one of the other ones I didn't talk about, the last one, is the rebels. So rebels are not conformists, they're not innovators, they're not ritualists, they're not retreatists. They believe that the system wasn't built for them. And this is where we see a lot of activism, right? And rebels believe that we should burn it all down and create a new system, one that benefits everyone. There's also spectrums to look at rebels. Rebels could feel like they're wronged. There's this whole wave right now that's taking place all throughout the country of individuals categorizing themselves as sovereign people. I don't know if you've heard of this before, but there's a lot of militia groups and they're coming out and they have chapters in different states, but they're identifying themselves as sovereign people. And we saw a lot of this be elevated in the media after the January 6th insurrection, people appearing in court and saying that your laws don't align with, or I don't need to abide by your laws because I'm a sovereign person. Um, and so there will potentially be more challenges towards the law itself, which the law itself is only as powerful as we allow it to be, right? It's a social norm. It's a codified social norm, right? It's the most grounded social norm that exists. And I always like to think of it on a ladder. You have folkways, mores, taboos, and then you get to laws, and they're the most grounded. They're on the ground. If you're thinking of hanging on a ladder, the higher you go up, the more unstable you are, right? And so folkways are the most inconsistent throughout societies,
Right.
but laws are the most consistent. And so in that regard, we'll see what sort of power plays here. And when we see a situation where a large amount of people start to challenge the laws, and they have power and they're able to reinforce themselves through that, there's fears of things like civil war that might come up, right? And those are conversations that are happening as in these shadows that we talked about, but also very much so in the media as of recent.
Yeah. And that's interesting because and I'm not sure how you define shadow, but like some of the stuff we're talking about now, all the different, not necessarily just the Civil War thing, but like everything, just all the different trends and concerns about like the way the direction that the society's headed in. And it's all over social media. It's interesting. It's interesting. It's just and even, I mean, like they got the big names that are being, silenced, through YouTube or whatever, but it's just too much of it. It's just, so there's people like YouTube, and like everything else, right? You listen to one thing and then it suggests other things, right? And
Mm.
there's tons of people out there like Andrew Tate, like Russell Brand or whatever, right? There's a bunch of people out there talking about this stuff about this just these trends that in society that could lead to something else, right? Could lead to just the instability of the entire nation. And it's interesting. And yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but if you have
Yeah.
thoughts on that, but
For
it seems like it's everywhere. It seems like it's coming out more to the surface. You can't silence it. It seems like it's just too
Yeah,
much.
I think for me, it's a just from, you know, speaking from an observer perspective, like I think uh we see a lot of these moral panics is what we call them, right? These moral panics have various elements to them. We see a folk devil, and the folk devil is this illustration or projection of what bad is. And folk devils could be anything. It could be gangbangers are often looked at as folk devils, or someone who dresses a certain way, or someone who might have tattoos is a folk devil, right? Or folk devils can be seeing things such as the media, right? They can be aligned with certain perceptions, or the government, right? And then you have these moral protector ideas of, okay, who's fighting against this, right? We need a whole nother way of going against this. And then you have the media and the way they may skew a certain story, or the way they may approach a story through different angles. You might have these protagonists involved. Sometimes protagonists are politicians themselves, or like a political figure, or maybe someone like a YouTuber or an influencer, or someone, a businessman, right? And these are people that are trying to gain leverage and power in terms of guiding the discourse the way it needs to go. And then the most important element out of all of these is actually us, right? We're the ones purchasing the tickets to the shows, to the Moral Panic shows. And we're the ones sitting in the red cushion seats and buying popcorn. And we're the ones applauding. And so these are the things that we get at when we talk about these moral panics, and the way they, from my perspective, the way they may shift the pendulum in the criminal justice system from crime control to due process. This past 2020, we started to shift into what we identify as a more due process era. And what that basically means is we were in a crime control era during the last 20 years. And it was all manifested after 9/11, right? And there's a sense of fear that happened, right? Where we started to say, okay, government, okay, society, you're okay to compromise these constitutional rights that I may have. You're a way to subject them accordingly in the name of public safety and order. right? Because our fear becomes so heightened where we are willing enough to say, okay, instill the Patriot Act, instill surveillance of my phone calls, right? We're willing to do those things, or we're okay with stop and frisks. We're okay with those types of, right? Because the threat exists. And this is where we get a lot of like very tough on crime policies. The same thing happened during the political 2.0 era in the 50s, 60s, right? And we saw the war on drugs be induced from this. And so in the transition in 2020, it is a boiling point under a conflict perspective where society says we've had enough. And what they had enough of was this crime control oriented era. They said, we're done with the militarization of police. We're done being surveilled. We're done being subjected the way we are. And the tipping point was the murder of George Floyd, right? And so we saw the murder of George Floyd on TV, and people saw it on their phones and screens and then the news. And it was the tipping point to say, okay, this is enough. And what that did is it didn't change the system, but it did swing the pendulum to the other side through another moral panic. And the pendulum on the other side says, okay, let's be more due process oriented. So now we have this elevation of, hey, we want our rights protected. We want a more wide-ranging view and definition of what public safety means. And this is where we're starting to get things like social workers going in rides with police. We're starting to police the police with body cameras, right? Like these are things to protect us. So we see that during a due process era typically. But here's the unfortunate thing that history has told us and shown us is in 40 years, maybe 50 years, maybe 30 years, we're likely going to have another catastrophic event that is going to swing the pendulum back to this very fear-induced society. And we're going to shift back and say, okay, here are my rights again. Take them. The risk is out there. And so when you ask me about sort of these views or these fears that might be perpetuated or talked about, or civil war, right? Like these conversations aren't new. And I guess the fearful part here is there something catastrophic enough, or is there something that's going to be so difficult for the public to view that it swings the pendulum all the way around the cog, and we don't know how to reconfigure or recalibrate the system? That's where you might have a system upended, but we won't go there because we don't want to scare ourselves. But you know, these moral panics are around us all the time, and you know, it's what we're willing to accept. It's what we're willing to allow and disallow. You know, these things are socially constructed and they can be socially deconstructed. And we give them too much power in many ways, right? And mostly what I'm criticizing here is policy. But when we talk about, you know, whether the system can be changed, you know, I don't know if it can, based off of what the historical trends have shown us.
Yeah, interesting. You know, this alone is a topic we could probably go on and on about. But I know that you, middle of the day, you have other classes waiting for you. So I'd like to, if you don't mind, we'll have to probably do this again. But I'd like to finish up with a question that I always like asking, just because I think it's a powerful one. It's a great one, right, for us to be able to look back on, especially for you. You know, if we look at this video 10 years from now. But I'd love to ask, if today, right, today was your last day, right, for whatever reason, you went to sleep, didn't wake up tomorrow. What three things would you want to be remembered by? What three things would you want people to know?
Wow.
That, yeah.
Wow. I think the first one that comes to mind is that I was my authentic self. I think that's a big one for me. That I was my authentic self in all the things I did, all the things I practiced, all the knowledge that I had or didn't have. I was projecting myself as my authentic self. And then I would say, and this would be society, right? Like trying to understand me.
Society, your family, yeah.
Oh, okay. I was like, how personalized do I make this? I think that there is a sense of value in the perspectives that allow us to seek validation and seek comfort and seek joy in this life. And I think the simplistic way of looking at that is to enjoy the little things. That'd be a big one, is to enjoy the little things. And it's the mundane, and making elevating the mundane that can allow us to cherish those memories a little bit deeper, rather than feeling like, it has to be some special or exoticized event or whatever it may be. Like it's the little things and the day-to-day interactions that are important. And those are what should carry us, and we should seek more value and significance in those. And then the last one, I think, would be to just and I guess for that second one, I would say a lot more to my family. I'd tell them I love them and all that, right? But the last one, I think, would be to keep learning as I attempted to, right? Like keep learning, whether it be about yourself, whether it be about the world, whether it be about a subject, whether it be about the law, to keep learning. There's so much to learn out here. And in a way, you're just learning about yourself through these learning experiences, right? Like we talk about school and being like, oh, I want to go to school to learn this subject. And it's like, you're actually learning about yourself. And that's the beauty of this world, that we get to interact with each other in those ways, and be able to learn from others so that we can learn for ourselves.
Yes, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Yeah. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Ramon, I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much. And if you're watching this and you made it this far, if you ever need anything, feel free to reach out to me as well. You can find me through various online searches. So yeah, take care of yourself, be well.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
Yeah, you take care of
pleasure.
yourself,
Yeah,
Ramon.
thank you. Yeah, likewise. Thank you. I appreciate you, taking the time today. And yeah, we'll have to do this again sometime. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Bye-bye.